Among my favorite types of commander decks are token strategies, and on Duskmourn, we have a frightening new legend that makes for a great option. Arabella Abandoned Doll is a 1/3 toy for a red and a white. Whenever Arabella attacks, it deals X damage to each opponent and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 2 or less. Arabella conceptually is based off of the story of Annabelle, an allegedly haunted Raggedy Ann doll that once resided in the Warrens Occult Museum, run by paranormal investigators Lorraine and Ed Warren. The doll was brought to the museum after several alleged hauntings dating back to 1970. The doll later inspired the lore of the Conjuring universe of films. Super spooky. As for our Magic the Gathering commander, Arabella Abandoned Doll uniquely focuses on converting our smaller creatures into both life gain and burn. The more creatures we control with power 2 or less, the greater her burn effect scales on her attack trigger. Because an Arabella deck seeks to make the most out of a large field of tiny creatures, we are going wide with this deck, looking to put as many weenie creatures into play as possible. Our goal is to utilize Arabella's ability to burn opponents out, though we can pivot to a traditional swarm tactic and turn our entire board sideways at opponents should we somehow lose access to the attack trigger. Since one of our main pillars of commander deck building is card draw, and because our color combination of red and white doesn't quite have the same access to card draw as some other colors and combinations, we have a number of methods in this deck to help keep our card draw online. Benny Brack's Zoologist is a 3/2 for 4 with Convoke, and at the beginning of each end step, you can draw a card if you've created a token this turn. Since the majority of our cards can generate tokens, this should be able to hit on nearly every turn. Enduring Innocence and Welcoming Vampire both draw as 1 card per turn when a creature of power 2 or less enters. Even though we will only get 1 card drawn off of each of these creatures, it's still solid enough card draw that we will be able to repeatedly access. Idol of Oblivion gives us card draw on the condition that we've created a token this turn, which shouldn't be too difficult, and should we have the mana for it, we can trade it in for a 10/10 Eldrazi token. The Eldrazi token might tower over all of our other creatures, but sometimes you need some cosmic horror to complement your paranormal horror. Skullclamp is, of course, a shoo-in, being able to trade in a token for 2 cards for cheap. Nearly every creature token this deck generates can be clamped to give us card draw, making this perhaps the most vital include. Smuggler's Copter is a vehicle that can crew for 1, meaning literally anything can pilot this card. Whenever it attacks or blocks, we can draw a card, and if we do, we discard a card. Well of Lost Dreams gives us card draw off of our life gain, letting us draw up to the total life we've gained. So what are we drawing into here? Let's talk about some cards that will either enter with power 2 or less, or create creatures with power 2 or less. Agate Instigator is a 1/3 that pings each opponent whenever another creature you control enters, and then for 2 additional mana as you're casting it, you can create the Offspring token, getting you a 1/1 copy of it. This will give you 2 triggers to ping each opponent whenever a creature enters. We have some cards that we'll talk about in a moment that will create several creatures at once, and so this can add up some burn damage outside of what our commander can do. Anim Pakal, Thousandth Moon, is a 1/2 for 3 mana with an attack trigger that puts a +1/+1 counter onto Anim Pakal, and then creates X 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature tokens that are also tapped and attacking, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on Anim Pakal. This will generate us more tokens as it grows, and it will help scale Arabella's ability. Once its power becomes 3 or greater, it will itself stop counting towards our commander's ability, but the tokens that it creates will. Assemble the Legion is perhaps my favorite Boros enchantment. Each upkeep gives us an additional squad of soldiers that have haste. This will incrementally grow our board state, and eventually it can overwhelm our opponents on its own. Clarion Spirit gives us a 1/1 white spirit creature token whenever we cast our second spell this turn. This is a pretty basic ability, but I think that the value it provides more than makes up for it, since both the Clarion Spirit and the tokens it produces are each power 2 or less. Felidar Retreat has a landfall trigger with 2 modes. We get to choose whether we create a 2/2 Cat Beast creature token, which does help out with Arabella, or we can put a +1/+1 counter onto each creature we control, and then those creatures gain vigilance until the end of turn. Giggling Skitter Spike has a multi-conditional trigger that goes off whenever it attacks, blocks, or is targeted by a spell, burning each opponent for an amount of damage equal to its power. I very much enjoy the concepts of theme and variation when it comes to commander deck building, and having this card's ability feels like a variation of Arabella's, making it very relevant to our deck. You can also pay 5 mana to make it monstrous, which would not go with the rest of the strategy, but if it isn't already monstrous, you could put 5 +1/+1 counters onto it, and then it becomes monstrous. This then becomes a 6/6 that'll damage each opponent just for engaging in combat or being targeted. Loyal Apprentice is a 2/1 which will count towards Arabella's ability, and it makes us a 1/1 Flying Thopter token each combat that'll also count as long as we have Arabella in play. Mad Ratter works in tandem with our card draw engines, giving us a 1/1 rat token whenever we draw our second card each turn. If we have this out along with something like Skull Clamp, we can pay 1 mana on each of our turns to clamp the rat token, draw 2 cards, and then create another rat token. Molten Gatekeeper is another creature that will ping each opponent whenever another creature enters. This one is a 2/3 for 3 mana, and it has an Earth, meaning it not only will help out with our commander's ability, but in the event that it gets sent packing, it could bring itself back to the battlefield. Nomad's Assembly and Stormherd can each create us massive armies all on their own, and while they are both pretty high on the mana curve for this deck, we are still going to want their abilities to help close out games. Should our life total be high enough, Stormherd can single-handedly create us enough creature tokens to turn Arabella's ability into a one-shot player board wipe. Sky Knight Vanguard is a 1/2 with flying, who creates a 1/1 soldier that's also tapped and attacking whenever the Sky Knight attacks. The Jolly Balloon Man creates us token copies of our creatures, except those copies are 1/1 balloon creatures with flying and haste, among other horrifying things. Now then, we want some win conditions that go beyond our commander's ability or simply swinging out with the armies of horror. We have a few unique cards in the deck that offer us ways to expedite the process of knocking the other players out of the game. Perhaps the most insidious is Grafted Exoskeleton, an equipment that gives +2/+2 and infect to the equipped creature. On Arabella, it converts her ability from burn damage to infect damage. Since creatures with infect will grant opponents poison counters simply upon them dealing damage to an opponent, but not specifically combat damage, Arabella's attack trigger will actually be dishing out poison counters. This drastically lowers the amount of work we have to invest in our board state, and we then only need 10 creatures in play with power 2 or less. Is it evil? Yes, but so is our commander, so let's go. The Crown of Doom is a fun little piece of tech for multiplayer, giving creatures that are attacking the player who controls the crown +2/+0. This is great to give to opponents just before you swing out with your army to give more incentive for everyone to attack at that player. Your opponents will have to play hot potato with the Crown of Doom because it can't come back to you and it wants to keep the heat off of their backs. Cavalcade of Calamity puts more burn ability on our attack, letting each creature with power 1 or less that's attacking deal 1 damage to the attack target. If you're swinging at an opponent with 10 creatures that are all power 1 or less, they're going to take 10 additional damage before blockers can even be declared. This makes the math for winning much easier, as you'll be grinding down life totals on so many fronts. Impact Tremors does a similar thing to the Agate Instigator in pinging each opponent whenever a creature enters under your control. If you control this, the Instigator, and the Offspring token, each creature that you will create will bolt each opponent for 3 damage, quickly pivoting us to a burn strategy. Throne of the Godpharaoh offers a burn ability similar to Arabella, though this triggers at the end step and it counts how many tapped creatures you control. If you've swung out with your entire board, whatever creatures are at the end step tapped will singe each opponent further. War Leader's Call also pings each opponent whenever a creature you control enters. It also brings an Anthem ability, which we don't really run many of for one simple reason. Arabella looks for tiny creatures, so even if their base power and toughness are 1/1, if they've been given Anthem abilities or +1/+1 counters to bulk them up to anything above a 2/2, they no longer count towards our commander's attack trigger. So one of our deck's main strengths is that we can play as a traditional tokens deck, swarming the battlefield with plenty of tiny creatures that will simply outnumber our opponents. Arabella's ability can go nicely on top of all of our usual attacking as a means to threaten all opponents at the table at once instead of just the defending player. We do unfortunately fold to decks that run debuff abilities. Something as simple as a Knight of Souls Betrayal type effect will ruin us since the vast majority of our creatures are 1/1s. There is a world where I play this deck extremely passively, simply holding up a growing army of 1/1 creatures that just gets bigger and bigger, blocking with individual cards as I need to, and then once we hit 40 or more creatures of the proper size, we simply swing out with only Arabella to one-shot the table. One of my favorite pieces of tech in this build is Meekstone, a 1-drop artifact that keeps all creatures with power 3 or greater from untapping during their untap step. Most of the time, our creatures will be too small to be impacted, and so this is a great way to keep blockers tapped down. Some great not budget friendly upgrades to this deck would be token doublers like Anointed Procession or Mondrak Glory Dominus, or even Oyurtak Deepest Foundation to get even more tokens. If you'd like to see the full deck list, I'll include a link to the Moxfield page where you can check out the cards that we didn't discuss here, playtest it, and see if you like it as well. With that, we will come to a close for our look at Arabella Abandoned Doll. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you enjoyed this deck. If so, likes and shares are always greatly appreciated, and I hope that if you're new here, you'll subscribe so you never miss a future upload. As always, my name is Flynn. Thanks for watching.